the sound of bare feet dragging across cold marble. Year 89, CE. You're standing in a Roman atrium pressed against the wall with 6 other witnesses. You can't move, you can't speak. Your only job tonight is to watch. In the centre of the room, an 18-year-old girl in a bridal veil stands frozen. In front of her, something draped in dark cloth. Behind her, a physician with a bag of instruments. Beside him, an elderly woman whose grip on the girl's arm says everything. There is no escape. The girl's mother wept this morning while braiding her hair. Her final words were a warning. Do not resist. Whatever they require, do not resist. It only makes everything worse. Now the girl reaches out, pulls back the cloth, and what's underneath, carved from dark wood, polished smooth by 1,000 brides before her, makes her face go white. But here's what she doesn't know yet. The statue is just the beginning. After that comes the physician's examination. After that comes the witnessed consummation. After that comes the documentation that will mark her body as legally transferred property. Every Roman bride for 1,000 years went through this. Every Roman mother prepared her daughter with the same whispered warning. And when Christianity conquered Rome, they erased it so completely that no one today knows it ever happened. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover has been buried for 2,000 years, and by the end, you'll understand why. This is the truth about Roman wedding nights, and the ritual they tried to erase from history. If this story grips you, drop a like. It takes a second and helps us pull more voices out of the silence. Now let's go back to that atrium, back to the girl in the veil, back to the moment before everything changed. Her name was Flavia Tersa, 18 years old, daughter of a minor Roman official who had spent 3 years negotiating this marriage. The groom was Marcus Petronius Rufus, a grain merchant, 43 years old, wealthy enough to matter, connected enough to be useful. Flavia had met him exactly 3 times before this day. She didn't love him. Love wasn't the point. In Rome, marriage wasn't about love. It was contract law, property transfer, a merger of families documented and witnessed, like the sale of land or livestock, and Flavia was the property being transferred. The wedding procession that morning had been beautiful in its way. She wore the traditional flame-coloured veil, her hair arranged in 6 braids bound with wool ribbons, exactly as custom required. At the temple, priests sacrificed a sheep and examined its entrails. The omens were favourable. The gods approved. Her father signed the contracts using the ancient formula that made the union legally binding. Flavia spoke the ritual words that generations of brides had spoken before her. Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia. Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. The phrase meant she was no longer herself. Her legal identity had been erased and rewritten in her husband's name. She belonged to him now, but the ceremony at the temple was just the beginning, the legal beginning. What waited at the end of the torchlit procession? In the house she had never entered, in the room where witnesses were already assembled, that was where the true transformation would occur. The crowds lining the streets sang songs as the procession passed. Not hymns, not blessings, obscene songs, explicit verses describing in graphic detail what would happen to Flavia that night. Young men shouted suggestions that made her face burn beneath the veil. Old women cackled and threw walnuts at her dress, a fertility blessing that felt like mockery. Her mother walked beside her, silent. Flavia had expected comfort, reassurance. Instead, her mother stared straight ahead, jaw tight, eyes empty. That morning, while arranging Flavia's hair, her mother had started crying. Not gentle tears. Deep, shuddering sobs she tried to muffle with her hand. Flavia had asked what was wrong. Her mother's answer came in a whisper. Do not resist. Whatever they require of you tonight, do not resist. It only makes everything worse. Flavia hadn't understood. She thought she knew what wedding nights involved. The basic mechanics, the expectation of pain. She had not prepared for what was actually waiting. The procession reached the house of Marcus Petronius Rufus as the last light disappeared from the sky. The doorway was decorated with wool and greenery, 2 torches marking this as a place where a marriage would be consummated according to law. Her husband stood waiting in the doorway. Behind him, Flavia could see figures moving in the lamplight. Too many figures, far too many for a private moment between bride and groom. Marcus lifted her over the threshold. Tradition said it was unlucky for a bride to stumble entering her new home. But the gesture symbolized something older, something from an era when women were carried into their husbands' houses, whether they wished to enter or not. The door closed behind her, and Flavia finally saw what was waiting in the atrium. Count them with her. An elderly woman in formal robes, the pronuba. Her role was to oversee everything that would happen tonight and provide testimony if the marriage was ever legally challenged. A priest of uncertain affiliation, his face half shadowed by lamplight. 3 female slaves carrying basins of water and clean cloths. An older man with a leather bag at his feet. Medical instruments visible through the opening. And in the corner, draped in dark fabric that concealed its shape, a wooden structure nearly 4 feet tall. Too many people, too many eyes, too many witnesses for what Flavia had imagined would be private. The pronuba stepped forward and took Flavia's hands. Her grip was firm, almost restraining, as though she expected Flavia to flee. "Welcome to your husband's home," the pronuba said. "The sacred rites must now be completed." Here's what almost no one tells you about Roman marriage. It was not a romantic union. It was not about love or companionship or building a life together. It was a property transfer, documented and witnessed like the sale of a farm or a ship. Roman law classified marriage as conventio in manum, literally coming into the hand. A woman passed from her father's legal ownership to her husband's. Before the late Republic, this transfer was absolute. A husband held the same legal power over his wife that he held over his slaves, including the right of life and death. By the imperial period, when Flavia walked that torchlit path, the law had softened somewhat. Women could own property. Divorce was possible, but the fundamental principle remained. Marriage transferred a woman from one man's authority to another. And like all significant property transfers in Rome, it required verification. Think about how Romans handled the sale of land. Witnesses observed the transaction. The property was inspected. Rituals invoked divine blessing. Boundaries were walked. Documents were sealed. Romans applied this exact logic to marriage. The bride's primary value lay in her capacity to produce legitimate heirs. Her body was the property being transferred. Her fertility was the resource being purchased. Roman law required both be verified before the transaction was complete. This wasn't interpretation. Roman legal texts state explicitly that a marriage was not valid until consummated. The consummation had to be confirmed by witnesses. The bride's virginity had to be verified. Each requirement generated rituals that made perfect sense within Roman legal logic, rituals that horrify us precisely because that logic is so alien to how we understand marriage today. The pronuba guided Flavia toward the draped figure in the corner. Flavia's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The pronuba's hand remained on her arm, firm and guiding, allowing no retreat. "You must greet mutunus tutunus," the pronuba said. "You must ask his blessing before your husband approaches. You must offer yourself as tradition requires." Flavia reached out with trembling hands and pulled back the cloth. What stood beneath was carved from dark wood, polished smooth by generations of use. It was shaped with anatomical precision into the form of a phallus. This wasn't a small amulet like the ones children wore around their necks to ward off evil. This wasn't a garden ornament. This figure was sized deliberately, proportioned carefully, designed for a specific purpose that became horrifyingly clear as the pronuba began explaining what Flavia must do. Mutunus tutunus was Rome's god of fertility and sexual initiation. We know he existed because multiple ancient sources mention him, always briefly, always with visible discomfort. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century as Christianity conquered pagan Rome, described the practice with outrage. Roman brides were required to sit upon the wooden phallus of mutunus tutunus as sacred duty before consummation with their husbands. The ritual was performed in the presence of witnesses. Augustine was a hostile source, writing to condemn paganism, but his description matches fragments from earlier, non-Christian texts. Lactantius, another church father, called it so shameful that even naming it pollutes the speaker. Arnobius provided the most detailed account, describing brides made to straddle the god's emblem, their new husbands looking on. The antiquarian Varro, writing centuries earlier with no Christian agenda, mentioned mutunus tutunus as a deity to whom brides were presented, using language that implied physical contact without explicitly describing it. Modern historians who address this ritual tend to minimize it. They suggest the bride merely sat briefly on the statue's lap in a symbolic gesture. But the language of ancient sources doesn't support that interpretation. Augustine's word was incidere, which means to settle onto, to mount. Arnobius used language implying penetration. Lactantius refused to describe the details because they were too shameful, an excessive reaction to someone briefly touching a statue. The stated purpose was divine blessing for fertility. The practical purpose, which Romans may or may not have acknowledged, was something else entirely. Preparation. Breaking down resistance, real consummation. Demonstrating absolute submission before witnesses. Conditioning a virgin bride to accept what would follow. Flavia stood before the wooden figure. The pronuba positioned her body, guided her movements, instructed her in what was required. The witnesses watched. Her husband watched. The physician waited to perform his examination afterward. And Flavia understood finally what her mother's tears had meant, what the obscene songs had been preparing her for, what being a Roman wife actually required. She could refuse, theoretically, but refusal meant disgrace for her entire family. Nullification of the contracts, return to her father's house as damaged goods. No respectable man would marry. It meant everything she had been taught about duty, honour, and a woman's place would be proven false, and she would be proven worthless. Flavia did not refuse. Think about that for a moment. An 18-year-old girl, surrounded by witnesses, facing something she never imagined, and her only real choice was obedience or ruin. I'm curious what's going through your mind right now. Drop a comment. I read every single one. After the ritual with the statue, slaves washed her in basins of scented water. This washing had religious significance, purifying her after the encounter with the god. But it was also practical, preparation for what came next. The physician stepped forward. This examination was not optional. Before any wedding involving significant property, a Roman bride underwent verification by a physician or midwife. Her virginity confirmed. Her physical state documented. The documentation became part of the legal record, establishing the bride's value. Roman medical texts describe the techniques used with clinical precision that leaves no ambiguity about what was involved. Flavia had already endured this examination once, before the wedding, to establish a baseline, to confirm she was intact, to verify she had never belonged to another man. Now, after the ritual with mutunus tutunus, the physician performed a second examination. This one verified the ritual had been properly completed, that her physical state was consistent with what the earlier examination established, that she was prepared for consummation. All of this occurred in the presence of witnesses, witnesses whose testimony might be required if any aspect of the marriage was ever legally challenged. What strikes modern readers about Roman descriptions isn't just the invasiveness, it's the casualness. Romans didn't view these rituals as traumatic. They were simply necessary procedures for accomplishing an important legal transaction. The bride's feelings about being examined, observed, and documented were no more relevant than the feelings of a farm being surveyed before sale. Property doesn't have feelings. Property is transferred according to proper procedures. After the examination, Flavia was led to the bedchamber, prepared for consummation. The room was decorated according to tradition. The marriage bed positioned for optimal visibility from the doorway. The doorway that would remain open throughout the night. Oil lamps provided sufficient light for the pronuba to observe from her position near the entrance. Slaves who would be needed afterward stood ready in the corridor. Marcus entered. He seemed nervous, which surprised Flavia. She had assumed he would be confident, commanding. Instead, he glanced toward the pronuba with something like embarrassment before approaching the bed. The pronuba's voice was formal and ritualistic. The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed this union. Let the marriage be consummated in accordance with the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses verify the completion. Let no one question that this woman has become a wife. What followed took several hours. The pronuba observed throughout, occasionally providing instruction, ensuring the consummation was completed in ways that satisfied legal requirements. The door remained open. Sounds carried into the corridor where slaves waited. Everything that happened in that bed was semi-public, part of a verification ritual designed to ensure no aspect of the property transfer could be disputed. At dawn, the physician returned for a final examination. This one confirmed consummation had occurred, that the bride was now physically changed in ways that marked her transition from virgin to wife. The examination was documented. The pronuba provided formal testimony regarding what she witnessed. The legal transformation was complete. Flavia Tersa was now a Roman wife. She would live another 40 years. She would bear 4 children, 2 sons, 2 daughters. She would manage her husband's household competently, attend festivals, honor the gods, fulfill every duty expected of a Roman matron. And she would never speak about her wedding night. Not to her friends, not to her sisters, not even to her own daughters when their marriages were arranged. Because what was there to say? It was tradition. How things had always been done. What being a Roman wife required. Her silence wasn't unusual. It was universal. Roman women didn't write about their wedding nights. Roman men didn't describe what they witnessed. The rituals were so embedded in Roman life that describing them seemed unnecessary. Like describing how one breathes. Everyone knew, no one spoke of it. This is why reconstructing these practices requires piecing together fragments. Hostile Christian sources condemning paganism, obscure legal references, embarrassed medical descriptions, archaeological evidence that only makes sense when you understand what it was designed for. The silence wasn't conspiracy, it was simply how deeply embedded these practices were. They were the water Roman women swam in, so omnipresent that describing them seemed pointless. For 1,000 years, this was what marriage meant in Rome. Generations of women experienced their wedding nights within this framework, understood their experiences through this lens, passed their knowledge to daughters in whispers that prepared the next generation. The system perpetuated itself because everyone accepted its fundamental premises. Property must be verified, transfers must be witnessed. Marriage creates legal obligations requiring documentation. Women are the medium through which families continue. The logic was internally consistent, even as it was externally monstrous. The end came, not from internal reform, but from external conquest. When Christianity transformed Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries, it brought fundamentally different premises. If women had souls equal to men, they couldn't be treated as property requiring examination. If marriage was sacred mystery, It couldn't include elements the church considered obscene. If modesty and privacy were virtues, the entire apparatus of witnesses and verification was offensive to God himself. The transition took centuries. It was never entirely complete, but in cities and among educated classes, the old ways were systematically suppressed. And the suppression included destruction of evidence. Statues of Mutunus Tutunus were smashed or buried. Texts describing wedding night practices were removed from libraries, allowed to decay, deliberately forgotten. Wall paintings depicting traditional scenes were whitewashed. The pronuba's role transformed into something purely ceremonial, a matron of honor who offered advice rather than witnessed consummation. Within a few generations, detailed knowledge of what Roman weddings actually involved was lost to everyone, except scholars studying fragmentary sources most people would never read. The Christians who transformed Rome weren't simply erasing embarrassing history. They were building a new civilization on Roman foundations while denying what those foundations actually supported. They succeeded so well that most people today have no idea what Roman marriage really involved. The comfortable myth of saffron veils and scattered walnuts replaced the uncomfortable reality of verification, examination, and ritual submission. But fragments survive. Fragments always survive. Augustine's outrage, Lactantius's shame, Arnobius's clinical descriptions, Varro's careful euphemisms. Enough pieces remain to reconstruct what happened in those lamplit rooms. Enough evidence survives to understand what Roman brides actually experienced. And enough silence surrounds it all to remind us whose stories were considered worth preserving and whose were not. Flavia Tirsa died in the year 131 CE, approximately 60 years old, a wife for over 4 decades. What did she think about her wedding night in all those years that followed? Did she remember it as trauma, as acceptance, as something in between? Did she wish something different for her daughters? Or did she accept that this was simply how things were? We cannot know. She left no writings. No Roman woman of her class did. The silence that surrounds these practices is the silence of women whose experiences weren't considered worth recording, whose feelings about their own bodies weren't relevant to the histories and legal texts that men produced. We know what was done to them. We don't know what they thought about what was done. But we know enough to understand why this history was erased. It reveals something uncomfortable about the civilization we inherited. Rome is supposed to be posed, the foundation of Western law, the model we built upon, the ancestor we claim with pride. Acknowledging what Rome actually did to its women complicates that inheritance. It suggests civilization and brutality can coexist, that legal sophistication can exist alongside systematic dehumanization, that a society can build aqueducts, write philosophy, and create enduring art, while treating half its population as property to be verified, documented, and transferred. The wedding night rituals of Rome are gone, but the women who experienced them were real. Flavia Tirsa was real. Her mother was real. Her daughters were real. For 1,000 years, generations of Roman women walked barefoot across cold marble toward wooden figures in lamplit rooms. They submitted to examinations. They endured witnessed consummations. They emerged as wives whose value had been legally verified, and then they never spoke of it again. Their silence lasted centuries, but silence is not erasure, and forgotten is not gone. They lived, they endured, they were silenced. But now, 2,000 years later, someone is finally telling their story. If this reached you, subscribe. We dig into the chapters history tried to erase, the voices that were meant to stay silent forever. Because the past isn't dead, it's just waiting in the dark, waiting for someone to remember.